Welcome everyone to another 90 Days of DevOps session. So I'm Ian Engelbrecht and I'm going to take you through logic apps. So just a little bit about me. I'm not a DevOps engineer or anything to that effect, more of an enthusiast. And today's session, I wanted to highlight the simplicity of using logic apps and exploring logic apps, streamlining your workflows. And this is a very easy way for someone that wants to get into DevOps to start. There's a lot of no-code approach to using logic apps. And what we're going to do today is I'm going to walk you through a demo, which I'll share some of the code into the GitHub repository. And the demo, essentially what we're going to do is we're going to create almost an app that will take a grocery slip or receipt. We will upload that into blob storage, which will automatically trigger a workflow, and that workflow will then use OCR to extract information from the receipt, do various API calls to match the contents of the receipt against recipes, and then at the end send you an email with an email with recipes of what you've bought from the grocery store. So essentially an app, codeless view app that you can get recipes for what you've bought from the store, right? And that all in a no-code approach using logic apps. So logic apps has a lot of connectors and plugins that you can pull into the workflow, and it's a visual workflow, so you can easily drag and drop certain items, add actions, add triggers. And what's nice about it is that you don't have to actually physically code anything. You can just pull something in, add some config, some settings to it, and it will process and run through the entire DevOps workflow essentially. So you're writing an app in essence, but you're using no code. You're just pulling in connectors to do the work for you and getting to an output in the end. This demo is just a very simple example. You could take it and expand on it. There's probably better ways to streamline the process, but this purely just to walk you through logic apps in Azure and how they can benefit you from a no-code approach. Okay, so to begin, what we're going to do is we're going to first create a logic app, right? So create a free account in Azure, or if you already have an account, just log in, go to resources, search for logic apps, create a logic app, right? So we will create a new resource group, give it a name, let's call it, this is a logic app name, 90 Days DevOps Session. And you must excuse my spelling, is one of my weaknesses. Once you've done that, I mean, you can follow the wizard. It's pretty straightforward stuff. I don't need to go through all of this. We will review and create once it's complete. So once it's completed, the deployment is complete, we can then jump into some configuration. So it essentially has finished deploying. Let's go to the resource group. Still waiting for the logic app. Okay, so it's finished completing. It's deployed. We can go to the resource itself and we can see it's deployed. First thing we're going to do is we're going to create a workflow. And essentially, this is the template that's going to be run through that it executes once we've triggered, right? So we're going to give it a name. I'm going to call it shopping. And I'm going to make it stateful, purely because I'm going to pass a lot of variables through this that are going to hold a lot of data. And I had some limitations on size of those variables when using stateless. So we'll use stateful. We'll create this workflow. While this creates, we're going to go and create a storage account. So the storage account we're going to use to upload the receipt into, and that will be the basis of the trigger as well. Into the resource group, we are going to create storage account. Same resource group, give it a name, and call it slip. Sorry, 90 days DevOps. And for simplicity, I'll just skip through all of this, leave it pretty much standard. Probably remove the soft delete and versioning, and we will review and create. So the deployment is running, just waiting for it to finalize, and then we'll create a bucket. So the storage account is created. We can go into the storage account, check storage browser, let's go to blobs, let's add a container, and we will call this slips or slips. Purely because I struggle to spell the word receipt. And we'll reference this later as a path to the receipt that we upload inside the workflow. So it's important to remember whatever you call the container, because it will be part of the path to the actual file that we need to OCR. So it's here, and essentially what we'll be doing later is uploading a receipt into this directory or container in essence, and that will automatically trigger a workflow, and from the workflow it will then OCR or pull in the path to the receipt, OCR that receipt, and then pass API function. So let's jump back to the logic. So we're back to the logic app. We can check our workflows. This should be the workflow we created earlier. So here it is, shopping. We can go in, and from here, a few things. If you're debugging, it's great to come and look at the run history. You'll have failed and success, as well as the duration it took to run that workflow. You could click on that, and then it will show you each individual step of the workflow. You can select each item, and it will show you what it processed, input, output. Great way to help you debug or check if you're getting the right variables, you're getting the right input, output for a specific step in the workflow. For now, we're going to use Designer. There's two views. There's a code view where you can supply entire JSON template for the whole workflow if you've already created it. So I'll share this. You could potentially take what I've done, copy and paste it in here, and you'll see everything in the Designer view. For now, we're going to build it from scratch. So the first thing you have to do is add a trigger, and the trigger is essentially what starts and kicks off the workflow, right? So for this, we are going to add a trigger when blob is added or uploaded, and the blob being the file that goes into the Azure storage. So we'll just go when blob and see what comes. So there, when blob is added or updated, so we will use that trigger. So it immediately wants obviously a storage account. So we need to connect this now back to that storage account. So we're going to give the connection, and these are the connectors within inside a workflow. So now we're connecting the logic app to another resource within inside of Azure. So we need to provide a connection name, which is an API connection into Azure storage. We obviously have to then authenticate against the storage, so some access keys. So I'll do this. We'll just call it blob. That's the connector name that will sit in the resource group, and I will use a connection string. So I've created a connection string, which is basically the endpoint, including the storage account name, including access key. I've added that in here. I will just authenticate, right? Once I've authenticated, it now wants the blob path, right? So let me input that. And if you remember correctly, I spoke about the container name itself, right, which is form part of the path. So we want this to trigger, but we want to monitor a specific container inside of storage account, and if something is added, so a blob is added to that container, i.e. an image, which is the receipt, then it must trigger the workflow, right? So that's the path that we're going to put in here. So the path is slips, which is essentially, copied it twice. Slips, which is essentially the container name, as well as a variable placeholder. So it slips the name of the file and PNG, right? So it will find all files with any name that have the extension PNG inside the slips container inside that storage account that we authenticated against. So essentially what will happen now, so that's configured. Now we have our first trigger. We need to add an action. So it's going to trigger as soon as a file with any name is placed inside that container that has the extension .png. It will then trigger this workflow. So that works for us because we're going to be uploading slips or receipts that end in an extension with PNG into that specific container. So the next thing is we need to then fetch the content, because it's an image, we need to fetch the content of the image or of the blob itself and then pass that into an OCR. So our next action is going to be get blob content. So you can see down here, Azure blob, get blob content. We're going to add that. We're going to add this action. So this is a trigger, then an action, and we'll then go to the next step. So we need to just complete the connection. So again, authenticating into a blob. Here we're going to just use access key. So storage account name and your storage access key. And then we can create the connection itself. So at this step, we need to add some settings or parameters for get blob content. So what is the storage account or the blob endpoint that it must get the content from? So we'll just use it from the connection. That is the storage account. You could add a custom value if you wanted to. At this point, we want to add a variable, right? So we want to pass, when a new blob is added, the trigger, we want to pass the path to that new blob file or blob, which is the file that's been uploaded, to the next action item, which is this path. So it must fetch the content of the specific file that's been uploaded. So we'll press just the formula bar here, and we will then fetch out of this trigger action, we will take a response from red blob action properties full blob path, right? So it's basically the blob's full path to the file itself, to the PNG file with the container name. So it's the entire path. So we add that in. So we go add, and that is going to be the variable that we'll use inside of this action. So if we understand here, when we upload the file, it's going to trigger, it's going to fetch a bunch of content about the file in this step. We're going to pass that information to the action step, right, where it's going to connect to this specific storage account, and it's going to use, when looking for a blob, it's going to use the response from the trigger itself, which gave us the path to the file directly, right? Okay, so the next step would be the OCR process. But before we do that, we can actually test our workflow itself. Let's just add an action, compose. I like to use compose as a output just to see if my workflow is running to the data correctly, input, output along the way. So here we'll just get blob content, file content, right? So I want to see the output of the second step, which is the action of getting content. So we just want to see the file content that was passed through, and we can use compose for that, right? So we just save this workflow. While we save that, we're going to need to generate a receipt, right? So I will share some links to a few websites that you can use to create some dummy data. This one specifically generates a dummy receipt. So you can input a bunch of information here, and here's a preview of what the receipt will look like. Essentially, we're going to add items like tomato, cheese, beef. So the value, $1, $2, whatever that be, the quantity, 7, 6, 1, so on. And you'll see that we'll just amend it to the receipt here, right? So there's the data being inputted into the receipt. Essentially, the OCR, we want to capture just the text tomato, cheese, and beef. The rest we're not worried about really. You could add some more intelligence if you wanted to understand how many tomatoes you have and how much cheese you have. You could try to do something like that. But for now, for the simple demo, it's purely just fetching the text that we need, and that text will be used to find out what type of recipes can we create with this text, right? So I've already created a receipt, but you could follow this process here, pretty straightforward, and then you just go and download the receipt itself. And once you have the receipt, so it's downloaded, download the receipt. Once you have the receipt, we go back to the Azure. We're going to go to the storage account itself, and we're going to upload the receipt into the blob container. And that will then trigger this workflow. And we can come back and see what the output of the workflow is thus far. There's still more steps we're going to add later. So back to the resource group, to the storage account, to the storage browser, blob containers. We're going to go into slips. So with inside slips, we're going to upload the receipt itself. So browse for files. We're going to upload that into the blob itself. You can see it's been uploaded. And based on the path we gave, it should trigger this workflow now with inside the Logic app. So let's go back to the Logic app itself and go and see if it's triggered. It should have triggered. And we'll be able to get some information about the triggering. So our workflow name, and you'll see under overview, just give it a second, there's a run history. And this is what I was speaking to earlier. Great way to sort of debug your workflow, to click on the run history so you can see when it was triggered, right? You can see the run history, and you click the identifier, it essentially takes you into a design view, and you can see the output and input of each action, right? So here the inputs, slip name, so that's what triggered it. You can see the output, which is the content itself, so the content that was fetched. So this is what was fetched by the trigger, which we then passed into get blob content. You can see the input, you can see the output of blob content. We can also see the compose action here, which I just like using as a debug. So this is the output, the PNG file. Obviously, it doesn't understand what it is, but we're going to pass this to an OCR, which will understand the image through its AI capabilities. So next step, let's go back to the Logic app, and let's start adding the OCR process. So we're going to go out of this run view, back to shopping, go to designer. We can delete this compose. We don't really need it anymore. I was purely just using it to debug or to actually get an example of the output that it was going to get. At this point, we need to add the OCR step, right? So computer vision is what we're going to use. We search for computer vision. While we try and find computer vision here, what we do need to do is actually add computer vision to our resource group, a free tier of computer vision that we can then use for the OCR process. So in another tab, I'm back to resource group. I'm going to create, we just type in computer vision here. There we go. And computer vision, let's create that. Create. Leave this all. I want it in the same resource group. Give it a name, call it OCR. Pricing tier. OCR, sorry. OCR DevOps. See if that works. right? And we'll just use that pricing tier. There is a free tier, but I've already created multiple resources, so you can use a free tier. And we will review and create. So we can create the resource now, and now we wait for the deployment to complete. So still deploying, deployment's in progress. There we go, successful. We can go to the resource now. I need to then get the access key and the API URL for computer vision so we can connect it via the connector in the Logic app itself. So let's see it here in the resource crew, OCR DevOps, and we're going to go to key point and endpoint management. Right, and there is the endpoint that we're going to use, and I will copy a key. So, okay, for the next step, we're going to add in the OCR process. So we're going to use computer vision API here. So we add the action, search for computer vision. We're going to see more here because there's a specific one that we want to use action, and that is optical character recognition. So OCR to JSON, right? So it's going to read through the image, find its text, and turn it into a JSON format that we can use later on. We want to pull, of course, that that text out of the image. So from here, source image is going to be image content, and we're going to use a expression here to point it to the previous step. So from get blob content, we want that output to pass through as the image content in this step. So if we go dynamic, you can see get blob content here as a dynamic content. File content is what we want to pass in to this OCR step. So we can do that, and we can save. The step after this is we're passing it into a JSON format, but we need to still understand what is contained in that JSON file or that JSON output. So we need to add a schema. And the schema is essentially going to allow us to reuse certain elements or properties from the OCR because we provided a schema that explains what each item within inside the JSON output is. For this, I've created a schema. I'll attach it to the repository. You can just copy and paste that in. It'll make it easier. But I will show you some cool steps that you could use to actually generate a schema. So let's just go parse JSON. We'll use this parse JSON step. Again, sorry, we need to put in the input for this step. So from here, dynamic content, and we will use the OCR output, so the JSON response, right? So the data that comes out as JSON format is going to be the input, and we need to provide a schema. This is a cool function. We can use a sample payload and paste it in here. So it could be you run an API call and you have a response, take that body of response, paste it in here, and it will generate a schema. So it will remove all the values and just generate the schema about the property and their values. So like array, string, so on. It will add that all and that structure so that we can, or the workflow can understand that at a later stage when you want to call that variable. And it's quite important because you'll see now, once I add the schema, the next step after parse JSON will be able to interact or call specific items from the JSON output. So for example, if we go back to this, if we look at what's coming out of the OCR process, these are the only known dynamic content or expressions I can use or reuse in the next function. But this doesn't help me because there's other data with inside that receipt that I need. So by passing this into JSON data action and then adding a schema, it's going to highlight specific information like the actual text on the receipt that is tomato and cheese. I'll be able to reference that individual text items in a a follow-up action because of the schema. So let's do that. Let me add the schema. So I've added the schema in here. I've just pasted in the schema. And you'll see it's just the layout of the JSON response, which I've generated. But I've shared this. I'll share this in the GitHub, so you can just purely copy and paste this. But again, you could generate your own if you really wanted to. Right? So we have the schema now. And what's interesting is let's add a compose function here as a test, just to show you what that schema does. So if I add in this compose data operation, and I go to inputs now, if I go to dynamic content, look at what's available under parse JSON. And if I expand it, there's bounding box, there's body text, body item, body words, and regions. These are specific things that I need to reference at a later stage. So it's much more than what you got out of just a default JSON response out of OCR. We passed it into parse JSON. We added a schema to identify the individual information, and now I can reuse that information in a later step. And that's essentially the point here. So if we go, let's use body text. Now, look what happens automatically. It creates a for each loop. Why it does that is because body text is an array. It's not a single string. Because it's an array, it has to iterate through every single body text item that is passed through JSON or through the OCR process. So there's more than one. Based on my receipts, you could see it's going to pick up quite a long list of different text. And that's why it's going to iterate through each one. So if you look at it, it's going to go through body regions. From body regions, it's going to move into lines, and from lines into words, and from words into text, essentially, which then we'll do current item for each. So it's going to pass the text then through into compose, and then I'll be able to look at the compose output and actually see the text that is identified. All right, so let's save this. Okay, so it's saved. So for us to do a test, all we're going to do is we're going to trigger the workflow. So if you remember correctly, the previous test we did, all we did was upload a receipt. So if I go to a new tab, you can see the receipt still there, the old one. We're just going to upload a receipt and overwrite it, right? Which will be detected as a block change. So if I go upload, browse for the files again, and we just overwrite it, upload. This successfully uploaded and overwritten. We go back. We can go and look at the trigger history. We'll see that it's kicked off the workflow, and we can see the output of our compose. So we can see here it's running. So if we look at the run, we can see it's looped through, just ignore the variable, we'll add that in now. It's looped through each iteration of the array. You can see you can pass through it like that. And you can see the input that the OCR gave, the output that the OCR gave. See 1435. So it's iterating through all the text that it detected in line. And it will get through, you can go through the sub as well. It will get to the point where it found the ingredients. What we need to add, which you can see here, is we need to initialize a variable as well as append what we've found in the output in compose into this variable array, and then we will filter that array out for only food types. So let's do that. So back in the designer view here between parse.json and the loop, we will just initialize the variable. So this is just essentially creating a variable. So the initialized variable, we'll add that in, give the variable a name. So we'll call it food text or OCR text. We'll change the type to an array, and we'll leave the value blank. So it's a blank variable that we create, and then we will append to this variable. So as it loops through each item, it will append and add each item that it's detected as text, pass it into the variable. So we'll have a variable array, which is essentially a long list of text that is detected out of the OCR process. So append to variable, and then select food text, which is the variable we created in the previous step. And then we give it a value. So what must it be appending? So we'll use the previous step, which is the compose. So let's add the compose output into the variable. So now it's going to add each food item, or not food item, each text from the receipt into the variable array. What we need to then do is filter that out. So let me show you, if you had to upload the receipt again into blob, you'll see an output of all the text that's added to the array. And I can show you that now. Let's just save. So if we look at the run of a workflow, we can see the inputs. Here's all the text that was found on the receipt, right? You can see tomatoes is there, beef is there. So what we want to essentially do is filter this array to only have food types. But in order for us to do that, we need to create a food list that we can use to compare against this array to filter out and get outputs, for example, beef and pasta, for example, right? So how do we do that? So first thing we do is I found a website that has a generic sort of food list or vocabulary word list, and I created a word list parameter from all of this text. So if we jump back, go to parameters here, we need to add in a parameter, and we are going to call this food list. It's an array, so it's an array of food items, and then we're going to give it a value. And the value is going to be the list of food items that we want to compare against. So let's create this. So I've just pasted the JSON directly in here. So you can find the JSON in GitHub and just copy and paste that parameter in here. You can also you could change or add additional word items in this, but you can see it's called food list. It's an array, and these are all the values in the food list. We can see, you'll see that it didn't detect tomato because I wrote tomatoes on the receipt, but you can essentially just come and edit the list here. So you'll see here it says tomato, and on the receipt I put tomatoes. You could add additional text to this list. There's probably easier ways to do this. You could also pass this information into another connection to try and identify types of word using language models and see what is associated to food and then filter that out. This, just for the use case that we're doing in this logic app, I found this to be the easiest. So we just save this parameter. And we're going to add an action item here, which is filter array. There's filter array as a data operation. We add that in. And firstly, the array that we want to filter out. So this is going to be the variable. So food text is the variable. You'll see now there's a parameter available because we created, which is food list. So food text. And what are we going to query? We're going to query the food list and see if it contains any of the variables or any of the words and text from the food variable that we've created, food text variable, right? So from here, we're going to go to food list and contains, and the value here, variable. So essentially what's going to happen is it's going to take the whole list of food items that I showed you as its input that we OCR'd from the receipt. It's going to run a query against the list of food items that we've created. And it's going to see if that food list contains anything that's inside the variable. If it does, it will filter out and only show us those food items in our variable going forward. So if we look at a previous run, we look at the filter, it essentially filtered out that entire input using that word list. And this is the output. So this is what's now contained within inside that variable. food list. And what we're going to do with this is we're now going to pass an API call with these specific food items to a recipe database and tell us what type of recipes can we make with these food items, right? And for that, you need to sign up with this service. So you go to Edamame and you'll sign up. I'm just going to log in. So once you've signed up and you're logged in, you can just go to the dashboard and go to applications, and you can create an application. When you create the application, you'll get an ID and a key. Right, so if I view this, I have an application ID and an application key, create a new key, so on. But essentially, we're going to use this to authenticate against the Edamame database and API. What I want to do next is show you the API example. So if we go to the documentation and we look through the APIs, we want to use this recipe search API, right? So if you look at it, what the API requires is the string public or private. We'll leave it as public. Let's just click try it out, right? Public or private, so that's required. App ID, I showed you the app ID. App key, I showed you the app key. And then Q, which is the query, and this is then the query of the food item. So we'll be passing those food items from array variable into this query string. And that's what we'll be searching against the database. There's a lot of other things, and there's a lot of information it passes back. For this simple demo and workshop, I'm just going to use the basics here. So let's add that and do a sample API call. So added the app ID and the key. Let's just add a query string. So we will say chicken. I warned you about my spelling. Chicken, comma, cheese, and potato. And let's see what it comes back with, right? So let's query this. So we'll execute this. You need to go back to the top. No, it's at the bottom. Execute. And we can see the response here, right? So it gives us an idea of what the request URL must look like, the headers and so on. But this is then the body that was passed back. Why this is important is because we essentially need to create another JSON pass with a schema to fetch this data so that we can reuse it again in the workflow. So this is the response that an API call will get. You can see it's found potato cheese baked recipe. There'll be other recipes in here. If you go through it, you'll see the other ones. We don't want all the information, but we want certain information. That's why you could essentially either take this response body and create a sample JSON schema for the logic app, or you could modify one to get the specific information we need. Just to what we're going to be finding is we want hits and we want recipes. And with inside recipe, we want the label and we want the URI. So essentially, we're going to send, okay, you bought potatoes, tomatoes, cheese. We're going to run a query against this API database or this recipe database via API call. We're going to return recipes, and we're going to then filter out just the information we need and pass that back to the user or myself via an email or whichever output you want. But all I want is the link to the recipe and what the recipe is called. So you'll get a response, recipe name, here's the URL for every single thing that you bought on the list, or those ingredients combined, rather. So let's jump back to the logic app and create this API call. So we are going to add another action item onto filter array, and we call it HTTP, which is going to be API request, right? We need to fill in the URI, which was pretty straightforward. You can get it from here. That was the URI right there. We need to add in the method, which is a get method. We need to add in some query parameters like the app ID, the app key, as well as we need to pass the variable or filter array into this as the food item query that is going to query, right? So let's do that. Jump back. Okay, so I've populated most of the information. There's the URI, there's the method, API or app ID that we are going to authenticate, the key we can use to authenticate, and then here's the query parameter, right? And this, if you remember correctly, what I tested on their website and their documentation, we manually entered some food items here, but here we're going to pass that filter array in and use that as the food items. So variables, food text, or actually, I'm sorry, we're going to use the filter array output. So it's the array that's been filtered just to food items. We're going to use that. We're going to pass that as the query of the food items we want to get recipes for. And that's our API call. What we need to then do is pass the output of this API call back into JSON. We need to pass the JSON so that we can reuse the values at a later stage. And this requires a schema again. So here we'll take the content, is going to be the output of the HTTP request. We can use the body of the HTTP. And we need to supply a schema. So we can use the body, but actually rather let's change that back to, let's just take the entire output, which includes the headers and everything, because my schema is going to include that. So we put the schema, and again, I'll share this schema on the GitHub repository, so you'll have it. You can use it, copy and paste it in, or you can create your own. Again, remember, you can use sample payload, and you can copy that out of the site here from its response body, paste it in, and it will generate a schema for you. But I've already created one. It's already here, so we can just use that. All right. The next step is to create another variable. So I want to pass the recipes or the individual items that I'm passing through the JSON parser. So for example, name of recipes. I want to create a list of name of recipes, and I want to create another list or array of all the URIs that are associated, so the links to those recipes. So I will initialize two variables. So we will initialize this variable, and let's call it food name, and it is an array. And we will create another variable, and we will call it food URI or URL, whichever you prefer, and we'll leave the value blank, right? Now we will loop, create another loop that is going to go through the past JSON output and allocate all the hits, if you remember correctly. So if we jump past back here, I want to fetch, so hits, and inside of hits, you have recipe, and under recipe, you have properties, URI, and label, right? But now under hits, you can see it returned 20 items. So there are 20 different recipes that it returned. So for each hit, I want to fetch the label in recipe and the URI in recipe, right? So we have to create another for each loop. So it's going to loop through each hits and fetch that specific data, pass it into each variable. So I created a variable for label, which is the name of the recipe, and I created a variable for the URI or the URL of each recipe. So let's do that. We go for each. We'll find a control loop. Let's have that. And when we set the parameter for what it should loop on, we will select dynamic content. You'll see now the parse JSON with the schema has now created 339 objects we could choose from. So that's purely from the schema we've added, right? So I want to find hits, and I want to loop through hits. So there's body hits under JSON, parse JSON 1. There is the expression, we add that in. And here we are going to add into variable. So append array. Append array 1 and append array 2. Okay. Which array? Food name and food URI. For food name, we're going to create a specific variable. So items, what am I spelling? Items, and then open bracket, and then we're going to use the for each. We can actually find that variable. Current item for each 3. So it actually looks like that. Items for each 3. Question mark. And then we will put square brackets. So it's already in hits. So we want to go from hits to recipe. My spelling is always probably have recipe. And from recipe, mark, we want to go to label. Essentially, let's just put quotes. And you can check that. So hits, recipe, under recipe, label. Right? You can see I spelled recipe wrong. Let's just change that. And we can add that as a value. Go to the second. And URI is in the same place as label, so we just replace label with URI and add that in. Right? So now it will append all that data, every single label into a variable and every single URI into a variable. So what's the next step? The next step, we are going to send the output of this. And for that, I just decided to do a basic email, right? So from here, we can go Outlook, send, wait for it to load. So we're going to add the send an email Outlook connector. We're going to give it a to address, so who should be receiving it. This could also be a variable. It could have been an email that you obtain via some process or input, the subject to the email, and then I've added these variables. So from the variable array of food labels, which is a food name, select number 0, then select number 1, then select number 2, then select number 3. And right below it, the URI number 0, URI number 1, URI number 2, and URI number 3. So the email body is, these are a few recipes for the food you recently bought, and then it will list each name of the recipe and its URI or link to that, right? So that essentially is the entire workflow itself. So let's zoom out. It's quite a workflow. Starts with a blob trigger. So as the receipt is uploaded, then fetches the content of that receipt, right? Passes that content to OCR inside of computer vision, which then reads the text of the image, converts that to JSON as an output. We take that output and we sort of classify it using a schema, and that schema then we can then use individual properties or objects within inside that JSON at a later stage which we do. We initialize a variable to fetch all the text that's in the JSON. We pass that text to a variable and we create an array. From that array, we filter it against a food word list, and we only get items of text that is food related. We take those foods and we send an API call to Edamame, and we fetch recipes. With the response, which is also an array of recipes, we then initialize variables. So you could have multiple. You could have what we did was a variable for a label, a variable for the URI, but you could also have a variable for the image of that food type. We then append that text to the variable through a loop, because we're going to loop through every single recipe that we fetched. There was 20. So for every recipe, fetch its name, fetch its URL, or link to the recipe, its image or thumbnail, append that to an array, and then we just send that in the body of an email. So here are your recipes. So end to end, you upload a receipt, you receive an email. Here are potential recipes you can cook tonight based on what you bought at the grocery store, right? Very simplistic, but the idea of this session was to get you to understand how you can use something like Azure Logic App to simplify workflows with minimal amount of code knowledge, right? There wasn't anything really that I did in here that required any kind of deep knowledge into programming or any kind of programming language. There are other cool things that you could do. You can add in JavaScripts, you can add in Python in between as different actions. So you can really get quite creative with it. I just want to show, if you do want to save this, and I've supplied this also with inside the GitHub repository, here's a whole code view of the entire workflow. So essentially you can copy all of this and create a new workflow, or create a new logic app, create a workflow. It will be blank. Go into code view instead of designer, paste the JSON in there, and when you save, you go into designer, you'll see all the different action items and triggers there. You would still need to create the connectors. Remember, each item I had to authenticate on certain ones, like this blob one, I have to authenticate against a storage account. That wouldn't be copied in the code view. So you can see the little icons here. You would need to re-authenticate these after you copied the JSON, right? So you would have to do the OCR for computer vision, the storage account auth, as well as, at the end I used a Outlook action, which I've authenticated against my Outlook account, right? So you would have to do the same thing. So let's quickly upload a final receipt. And from that, I'll show you what the body or what the email output looks like, right? So this would almost be user experience. Let's call it that. So here we go. Let's upload a receipt. Put it up. We'll overwrite the existing receipt. It will pick that up as a change. Okay, now without looking at the workflow, all we do is wait for an email to come through, which is the final action on the receipt. So let's go check my email inbox. And there we have it, an email, right? These are the recipes. Food you recently bought, 3 cheese, beef pasta with shells, beef stroganoff, ground beef pasta skillet, and so on, goulash. But you get the idea. And that essentially is what the plan was for this session, was just to take you through a simple process on how we created sort of a app workflow end-to-end with no code. I hope you enjoyed the session. Please make changes to the project, be creative, and share in the comments or share feedback on what you think and the ideas you might have changed, and maybe some new ideas on how to use a Logic app. Thank you.